Chapter 24. Do humans breed like flies or like Norwegian rats? If we breed like rabbits, in the long run, we have to live and die like rabbits. A.J. Carlson, Science versus Life, Journal of the American Medical Association. Heavier-than-air flying machines are impossible. Lord Kelvin, the world's greatest physicist at the time, in 1895, in Cerf and Navasky. Man will not fly for 50 years. Wilbur Wright to Orville Wright, 1901, in Cerf and Navasky, 1984. Many who worry about population growth in poor countries assert that people breed naturally. That is, poor people are assumed to have sexual intercourse without taking thought or doing anything about the possible consequences. In the words of environmentalist William Vogt, whose Road to Survival sold millions of copies, population growth in Asia is due to untrammeled copulation by Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus, and the rest of the backward billion. Biologist Carl Sachs asserted that nearly two-thirds of the world's people still rely largely on positive checks, death by starvation and disease, to control excessive growth of populations. Or as Robert C. Cook, the longtime population activist and editor of Population Bulletin, put it more politely, over 1 billion adults in less developed countries live outside the realm of decision-making on this matter of family size. This idea goes hand in hand with the view that population growth will increase geometrically until starvation or famines halt it, in the ever-ascending curve shown in Figure 22.1. The same view of human behavior underlies the assertion of Herman Daly and Clifford Cobb that our current practice is allowing new human beings to be unintended byproducts of the sexual fumblings of teenagers whose natural urges have been stimulated by drugs, alcohol, TV, and ill-constructed welfare incentives. The notion of natural breeding, natural fertility, and untrammeled copulation has been buttressed by the animal ecology experiments that some biologists offer as analogies to human population growth. Their models include John B. Calhoun's famous Norwegian rats in a pen, hypothetical flies in a bottle or germs in a bucket, and meadow mice or cotton rats, which will indeed keep multiplying until they die for lack of sustenance. Daniel Zero. Price, in the 99th Hour, gives a typical example of this view. Assume there are 2 germs in the bottom of a bucket, and they double in number every hour. If the reader does not wish to assume that it takes 2 germs to reproduce, he may start with 1 germ 1 hour earlier. If it takes 100 hours for the bucket to be full of germs, at what point is the bucket 1/2 full of germs? A moment's thought will show that after 99 hours, the bucket is only half full. The title of this volume is not intended to imply that the United States is half full of people, but to emphasize that it is possible to have plenty of space left and still be precariously near the upper limit. It is interesting that a similar analogy was suggested by Benjamin Franklin 2 centuries ago. In Malthus's words, it is observed by Dr. Franklin that there is no bound to the prolific nature of plants or animals, but what is made by their crowding and interfering with each other's means of subsistence. This is incontrovertibly true. In plants and animals, the view of the subject is simple. They are all impelled by a powerful instinct to the increase of their species, and this instinct is interrupted by no reasoning or doubts about providing for their offspring. The superabundant effects are repressed afterwards by want of room and nourishment, and among animals, by their becoming the prey of each other. Perhaps the most nightmarish of the biological analogies came from Alan Gregg, the former director of the Rockefeller Foundation's medical division. There is an alarming parallel between the growth of a cancer in the body of an organism and the growth of human population in the Earth's ecological economy. Gregg then asserts that cancerous growths demand food, but so far as I know, they have never been cured by getting it. The analogies can be found in Our Plundered Planet. Gregg then goes on to observe how nearly the slums of our great cities resemble the necrosis of tumors, and this raises the whimsical query, which is the more offensive to decency and beauty, slums or the fetid detritus of a growing tumor? Some demographic facts suggest that humans will increase the number of children when conditions permit. After food supplies and living conditions began to improve in European countries several centuries ago, the birth rate rose. and the same effect has been observed in the poor countries in the 20th century. While the data are not so good as to give decisive evidence, it seems very likely that natality has risen over the past generation, certainly in the West Indies, very likely in tropical America, and probably in a number of countries of Africa and Asia. But we must recognize what Malthus eventually came to recognize. After he published the short simplistic theory in the first edition of his Essay on Population, he took the time to consider the facts as well as the theory. He then concluded that human beings are very different from flies or rats. When faced with the limits of a bottle-like situation, people can alter their behavior in the short run so as to accommodate to that limit, and in the long run, people usually alter the limit itself. Unlike plants and animals, people are capable of foresight and may abstain from having children from fear of misery. That is, people can choose a level of fertility that fits the resources that will be available. As Malthus put it in his later writing, impelled to the increase of his species by an equally powerful instinct, reason interrupts his career and asks him whether he may not bring beings into the world for whom he cannot provide the means of support. People can also alter the limit, expand the bottle or the lily pond by consciously increasing the resources available. When the town's population has grown enough so that the school is full, the town builds an additional school, usually a better one than the old school. The arithmetic about how many doublings it takes to fill the container is nothing but pretty arithmetic, wholly irrelevant to human issues. Malthus came to stress the difference between the breeding of animals and of humans, and he decisively rejected Benjamin Franklin's animal analogy. The effects of this preventive check on man are more complicated. The preventive check is peculiar to man and arises from that distinctive superiority in his reasoning faculties, which enables him to calculate distant consequences. Human beings are different from the animals in that we have much more capacity to alter our behavior, including our fertility, to meet the demands of our environment. To control fertility in response to the conditions facing them, people must be capable of rational, self-conscious forethought that affects the course of sexual passion, the kind of planning capability that animals apparently do not possess. Therefore, we must briefly ponder the extent to which reason and reasoning have guided the reproductive behavior of individual persons in various societies at different periods in their histories. To put the matter bluntly, we must inquire into the notion, often held by the highly educated, that uneducated people in poor countries tend to breed without foresight or conscious control. For most couples in most parts of the world, marriage precedes childbearing. It is therefore relevant to a judgment about the amount of reasoning involved in breeding that marriages are contracted, in most primitive and poor societies, only after a great deal of careful thought, especially with reference to the economic effects of the marriage. How a marriage match is made in rural Ireland shows the importance of such calculations. The young lady's father asks the speaker what fortune do he want. He asks him the place of how many cows, sheep, and horses is it. He asks what makings of a garden are in it. Is there plenty of water or spring wells? Is it far from the road? He won't take it. Backward places don't grow big fortunes. And he asks, too, is it near a chapel and the school or near town? The inner countryman could pause here. He had summarized a very long and important negotiation. Well, he went on, getting to the heart of the matter, if it is a nice place, near the road, and the place of 8 cows, they are sure to ask 350 fortune, pounds dowry. Then the young lady's father offers 250. Then maybe the boy's father throws off 50. If the young lad's father still has 250 on it, the speaker divides the 50 between them. So now it's 275. Then the young man says he is not willing to marry without 300, but if she's a nice girl and a good housekeeper, he'll think of it. So there's another drink by the young man, and then another by the young lady's father, and so on with every second drink till they're near drunk. The speaker gets plenty and has a good day. An astute weighing of economic conditions is also seen to affect marriage in a southern Italian town that was as poor as any place in the Western world. The young man whose account is given lived in a family of 4, whose total yearly cash and computed income amounted to $482 in 1955 dollars. Edward Banfield described the courtship and marriage decision. In 1935, I was old enough to marry. My sisters wanted me to take a wife because they had no time to do services for me. At that time, there was a law that anyone who was 25 years old and not married had to pay a celibacy tax of 125 lire. That amount was much, if we recall, that to earn it, you had to work 25 days. I thought it over and finally decided to marry. My present wife was at that time working with relatives of my employer. Once I stopped her and asked her to marry me, and she liked the idea too, but I had to tell it before her father. He was happy to accept me, and we talked about what she had to bring as dowry and what I had to do. He asked me to bring my mother to call so that everything would be fine. The next time I brought my mother, and we had a nice feast. When I wanted to meet my fiancée, I had to ask the boss permission. In 1937, I asked the girl and her family to hasten the marriage before I was 25 years old. The father told me that she was not ready with the dowry. I asked him if at least we couldn't have the civil ceremony on February 6, 1938, 2 months late, so that I had to pay the tax for that year. Once my mother and I went to Addo to visit my father-in-law in order to discuss and establish definitely what they were going to give us in the dowry. My mother wanted everything to be conveyed through a notary. My father-in-law gave us 1 tamalo of land, and my mother gave the little house, but she reserved for herself the right to use it. Everything was written on official tax stamp paper by the notary. As soon as my wife was ready with the dowry, the church marriage was set for August 25, 1938. As to reason and self-control after marriage, there has been much debate among demographers in recent years about whether in pre-modern societies fertility is or is not natural, that is, at a rate equal to the biological limit. As I read that literature, those who reject the natural fertility proposition have the better data and analyses, but a conclusive answer is still to come. In virtually no observed society, except, paradoxically, the very modern Hutterites in the US and Canada, and a few other such groups, does actual fertility approach women's fecundity, potential fertility. And in many primitive societies, fertility is quite low. The anthropological evidence for fertility control within marriage also seems convincing. Even among the most primitive and backward of people, fertility seems to be subject to both personal and social constraints. One example is the primitive, as of 1936, Polynesian island of Tikopia, where strong social conventions enforce celibacy upon some people and cause others to limit the number of their offspring. And the motive of a married pair is the avoidance of the extra economic liability which a child brings. Another example is the effect of the size of the harvest on marriages in Sweden in the 18th century, a backward agricultural country then, but one that happened to keep good vital statistics. When the harvest was poor, people did not marry, as figure 24-1 shows. Birth rates were also responsive to the harvest, and even unmarried procreation was affected by objective economic conditions. This is clear evidence that poor people's sexual behavior is sensibly responsive to objective circumstances. After an extensive study of the anthropological literature, A.M. Carr Saunders concluded, "The mechanism whereby numbers may be kept near to the desirable level is everywhere present, the particular mechanisms being prolonged abstention from intercourse, abortion, and infanticide." And as a result of a study of data on 200 societies from all over the world, from tropic to Arctic, from sea level to altitudes of more than 10,000 feet, Cleland S. Ford concluded that both abortion and infanticide are universally known. It is extremely common to find a taboo on sexual intercourse during the period when the mother is nursing. In nearly every instance, the justification for this abstinence is the prevention of conception. He also found instances of many kinds of contraceptive practices. Some are clearly magical. Others are relatively effective mechanical devices, for example, inserting a pad of bark cloth or a rag in the vagina and attempts to flush out the seminal fluid with water after intercourse. In the 1960s, there was a widely reported estimate that 5 million U.S. women lacked access to contraception, but later analysis produced a more solid estimate of 1.2 million women. Surveys document that perhaps 10% of children born in the United States in the 1980s were the result of lack of knowledge of or access to contraception and could be said to be unwanted by the mothers at the time of conception. And many of these mothers later became glad that they had the children. If the definition of unwanted included both the mother and the father, the proportion of unwanted at conception would be much lower yet. There continue to be some supposed experts and officials of anti-population growth organizations who, on the basis of discredited anthropological accounts, assert that poor people do not know how babies are made, a notion so silly that it should not be necessary even to mention it. For example, not only are animals ignorant of the relation between mating and offspring, but even modern man until the last few thousand years was probably equally ignorant. In fact, there were recent reports of primitive tribes in Australia who are similarly unenlightened today. More to be believed are such stories as the one about a primitive tribesman who said to another, "Do you know what I told that white man? I told him I don't know how to make a baby." And get this, he believed it. This joke has now been documented in astonishing fashion. Ever since the 1920s, Margaret Mead's Coming of Age in Samoa has been considered as great a classic in anthropology as any other book, providing the foundation for an entire ruling theory of human behavior. In 1983, Derek Freeman disproved her account using a variety of materials, but more recently there emerged incontrovertible evidence that Mead was not only wrong, but had been hoaxed. If Mead's conclusion of 1928 had been correct, it would have been the most important conclusion of 20th century anthropology. It is now known that Mead's long influential conclusion was wholly false. In 1983, I was able to demonstrate in detail that Mead's extreme conclusion was very definitely not supported by the relevant ethnographic evidence. And since then, there have been even more significant developments. It had long been a major mystery that Mead's account of Samoan sexual behavior, on which her conclusion rests, is radically at odds with the reports of all other ethnographers. This mystery was solved in 1987, when Fapua Fa'amu, who is listed in Coming of Age in Samoa as one of her principal informants, came forward to confess that in March of 1926, as a prank, she and her friend Fofoa had completely hoaxed Margaret Mead by telling her, when she questioned them, the antithesis of the truth about Samoan sexual behavior and values. In Samoa, the playing of such pranks, which they call taufa'ase, is commonplace. When Mad put to Fapua, who was herself a taupu or ceremonial virgin, the supposition that she was promiscuous, she and Fofoa, with sidelong glances and pinching one another, set about hoaxing her. They had no idea, says Fapua, that Margaret Mead was an author, and that their wild untruths would be published as facts in an immensely influential book. After Fapua's testimony had been carefully checked by Lulu Felici Va of the National University of Samoa, a sworn deposition by Fapua Fa'amu has been lodged with the American Anthropological Association in Washington, D.C. What testimony, then, can we trust? Clear evidence that poor people consider their incomes and economic circumstances when thinking about having children is found in their answers to questions about the disadvantages and advantages of large families. A variety of such surveys in various parts of Africa reveal that economic motivations are indeed important. Study after study shows that poor people do indeed think about economic circumstances in relationship to fertility. They do not practice untrammeled copulation or breed without limit. People in developed countries, too, are accustomed to think about how family size fits their incomes. Grenoble, France, a 29-year-old grade school teacher gave birth yesterday to quintuplets, 3 boys and 2 girls. The children's grandfather, a tailor, said, "This certainly creates a lot of problems, and you can't say it's really a joyous event because you've got to think about raising the little wolves." Lee Rainwater interviewed 409 Americans about their family design. In representative interviews with 3 pairs of husbands and wives, all mentioned economic factors predominantly, though many other factors were also mentioned, of course. Husband 1, "Would I prefer 2 or 4 children? I guess 2, because you can give 2 more than 4. You can send them to college. The average family could not give 4 very much. 2 is all we can support adequately. 2. But if I had loads of money, I would want loads of kids. If I had lots of money, enough for full-time help, and plenty of room, I would like half a dozen or more. Husband 2. I think 2 is ideal for the average American family based on an average income of $5,000. I don't see how they could properly provide for more children. Personally, I'd take a dozen if I could afford them. I wanted 4 when we got married, or as many as the family income could support. I think 3 is ideal because I feel this is all most people are equipped to raise, to give a good education, and send them through college. Another study asked a sample of U.S. wives why their intended family size was not bigger. The first reason given by more than half of the respondents was economic. In brief, even though income in rich countries is ample to provide a bare subsistence for many more children than the average family chooses to have, people say that their incomes constrain their family size. In all societies, rich or poor, people give much thought to sex, marriage, and childbearing. Fertility is everywhere subject to some rational control, though the degree to which achieved family sizes match the desired size varies from group to group. Couples in some countries plan their family size more carefully and are better able to carry such plans to fruition than are couples in other countries because of differences in contraceptive technology, infant mortality, and communication between husband and wife. But certainly, there is strong evidence that people everywhere think rationally about fertility. Hence, income and other objective forces influence fertility behavior to a significant degree, everywhere and always. An interesting example of how home economics affects fertility occurred in East Germany following the introduction in 1976 of incentives to have more children. Prior to that time, fertility in East and West Germany had been much the same, but the incentives raised marital fertility, at least temporarily, perhaps just having some births occur earlier, and more permanently raised extramarital fertility, as Figure 24-2 shows. The fact that there are large families in some poor countries does not prove the absence of rational planning in matters of fertility. Behavior that is reasonable in London or Tokyo may well be unreasonable in a Tibetan or African village. The costs of rearing children are relatively less, and the economic benefits of having children are relatively greater in poor agricultural communities than in well-off urban places. Therefore, even though the primary motive for having children, in Nigeria as in France, surely is that couples want children for the satisfactions they give, the economic conditions may differ in such a manner that the same desire for children that sensibly implies a 2 or 3 child family in a city may imply a 5 or 6 child family in a poor rural area. The economics of child rearing involve the amounts of time and money that people spend on children, on the one hand, and the amounts of work that children perform and the old age support they render after they grow up, on the other hand. It costs more time and money to rear children in urban than in rural areas, and children in rural areas of poor countries perform more work than children elsewhere. Hence, the larger average size of rural families may reflect sound economic planning. We see this vividly in the following accounts from the period of very high population growth a decade or 2 ago. Babarpur, India, May 24, 1976. Munshi Ram, an illiterate laborer who lives in a crude mud hut in this village 60 miles north of New Delhi, has no land and very little money. But he has 8 children, and he regards them as his greatest wealth. It's good to have a big family, Mr. Ram explained, as he stood in the shade of a leafy neem tree in a hard, dry courtyard crowded with children, chickens, and a dozing cow. They don't cost much, and when they get old enough to work, they bring in money, and when I am old, they will take care of me. Mr. Ram, who says he is not likely to have more children, is aware that the government is now campaigning hard with the birth control slogan, "Stop at 2," but he has no regrets. Children are the God's gift, he said, as several of his own clustered around him. Who are we to say they should not be born? Here are 2 more examples, this time through the eyes of an Indian writer. Let us take a few examples. Fakir Singh is a traditional water carrier. After he lost his job, He remained as a messenger for those Jat families which used to be his Jajmans, barely earning a subsistence living. He has 11 children, ranging in age from 25 to 4. Fakir Singh maintains that every one of his sons is an asset. The youngest one, aged 5 or 6, collects hay for the cattle. The older ones tend to those same cattle. Between the ages of 6 and 16, they earn 150 to 200 rupees a year, plus all their meals and necessary clothing. Those sons over 16 earn 2,000 rupees and meals every year. Fakir Singh smiles and adds, "To raise children may be difficult, but once they are older, it is a sea of happiness." Another water carrier is Taman Singh. He welcomed me inside his home, gave me a cup of tea with milk and market sugar, as he proudly pointed out later, and said, "You were trying to convince me in 1960 that I shouldn't have any more sons. Now, you see, I have 6 sons and 2 daughters, and I sit at home in leisure. They are grown up, and they bring me money. One even works outside the village as a laborer. You told me I was a poor man and couldn't support a large family. Now you see, because of my large family, I am a rich man." Hand in hand with the short-run reduction in fertility when times worsen in a poor country is the short-run increase in fertility that accompanies a betterment of conditions. Consider, for example, this report about an Indian village. In the early 1950s, conditions were distinctly unfavorable. The large influx of refugees from Pakistan was accompanied by severe disruption of economic and social stability. We were repeatedly told by village leaders on the panchayat, or elected village council, that important as all of their other problems were, the biggest problem is that there are just too many of us. By the end of the study period in 1960, a remarkable change had occurred. With the introduction of more irrigation canals and with rural electrification from the Bhakra Nangal Dam, and with better roads to transport produce to market, improved seed and other benefits of community development, and especially because there were increasing employment opportunities for Punjabi boys in the cities, a general feeling of optimism had developed. A common response of the same village leaders now was, "Why should we limit our families? India needs all the Punjabis she can get." During this transitional period, an important reason for the failure of education and family planning was the favorable pace of economic development. Children were no longer a handicap. Infant mortality is another influence that uneducated villagers take into account very rationally. In 1971, I asked a few men in Indian villages why they have as many or as few children as they do. A common answer came from a man with 5 children. 2, maybe 3 will die, and I want to have at least 2 that live to become adults. But by the 1990s, villagers in most parts of the world know that the infant mortality rate has fallen very fast in recent decades, and they need not have many more babies than the number of children they want to raise to maturity. This change in conditions, and in people's perception of the change, is part of the reason that fertility has fallen rapidly in so many countries, as seen in Figure 23-5. Malthus's theory of population asserts that because fertility goes up if income goes up due to new technical knowledge of agriculture, the extra population eats up the additional income. That is, Malthus asserted a tendency for humankind to be squeezed down to a long-run equilibrium of living at bare subsistence. This is Malthus's dismal theorem. But when we examine the facts about fertility and economic development, as Malthus himself finally did, after he quickly dashed off his first edition, we find that the story does not end with the short-run increase in the birth rate as income first rises. If income continues to rise, fertility later goes down. There are 2 main reasons for this long-run decline in fertility. First, as income rises in poor countries, child mortality falls because of better nutrition, better sanitation, and better health care. Though in the 20th century, mortality may decline in poor countries even without a rise in income. As couples see that fewer births are necessary to achieve a given family size, they adjust fertility downward. Evidence on responsive families to the death of a child buttresses the overall historical data. Several careful researchers have shown that there is a strong relationship between the death of a child and subsequent births in a family. That is, couples produce additional children to make up for children who die. If we also consider that families decide to have additional children to allow for deaths that might occur in the future, the relationship between child mortality and fertility shows that childbearing is responsive to the family's circumstances. A rise in income also reduces fertility in the long run through a cluster of forces set in motion by increased income, including A. Increased education, which improves contraception, makes children more expensive to raise, and perhaps alters people's tastes about having children, and B. A trend to city living, where children cost more and produce less income for the family than they do in the country. The decline in mortality and the other forces set in motion by economic development reduce fertility in the long run. This process is the famous demographic transition. We see it very clearly in the excellent historical data for Sweden shown in Figure 23.6. Notice how the death rate began to fall before the birth rate fell. And we can see the same relationship between income and birth rate in a cross-sectional look at various countries of the world, Figure 24-3. From the 1930s through the 1950s, most demographers were convinced that the demographic transition would take place in developing countries in the 20th century, just as it had earlier happened in Europe and North America. Then, in the 1960s, demographers began to worry that fertility would not fall in poor countries even after mortality fell. But in the 1970s, evidence showed that fertility was indeed falling in at least some developing countries. By the time of the first edition of this book in 1981, I wrote that we could be reasonably sure that the European pattern of demographic transition will also appear in other parts of the world as mortality falls and income rises, though there were still many doubters, especially those who run anti-natalist organizations. In the 1990s, we can take out the qualifier reasonably because the fall has appeared almost everywhere and in all the countries with large populations, as seen in Figure 23.5. Worth mentioning because many persons believe that teenage childbearing in the United States runs counter to the general pattern. Fertility has fall among the 15-19 age group over the long run, as Figure 24.4 shows, though the latter half of the 1980s showed an upturn too brief to be meaningful. So the foundation is gone from under Malthus's grand theory and his dismal theorem. At the heart of Malthus's theory, quoting from his last edition, is the following. 1. Population is necessarily limited by the means of subsistence. 2. Population always increases when the means of subsistence increases. The history of the demographic transition and the data in Figure 12 disprove the second proposition. The first proposition is shown to be false in chapters 5 to 8. Contrary to Malthus, people respond to the two major influences on fertility, mortality and level of income, in an economically appropriate fashion. Of course, there are delays, especially in the response of society as a whole to changes in the cost of a family's children to other people in the community. But overall, the fertility adjustment system works in such a fashion that it leads to an optimistic outlook rather than the dismal view described by Malthus in the famous first edition of his book, before he changed that view in the second edition. How many children would families have if material resources presented no constraints at all? That is, what would be the level of fertility if child mortality were as low as in advanced countries now, and if income were very high, say 10 times the level in the US now? We have little basis for predicting whether population would tend to increase, decrease, or stabilize in the long run in such a case, because there is no experience to learn from. It is clear, however, that where the material conditions of income and child mortality are harsh, fertility adjusts to meet those conditions, even among poor and uneducated people. But what about the costs that big families impose on society as a whole? Certainly, this is a reasonable and important question, because any child does impose some monetary and non-monetary costs on persons other than the parents. There are two parts to the answer. 1. An additional person causes not only costs, but also benefits for others in a variety of ways that we shall discuss later. The central question may be expressed quantitatively, which are greater in various years following a child's birth, the costs or the benefits to others. Once we know whether these external effects are positive or negative in any given year, we must next ask, are the external effects large or small compared with other costs and benefits in the economy? These matters are discussed in chapters 25 and 34. 2. The burden upon the community of an additional child depends very greatly upon the nature of the economic political system. In Chinese cities, where housing and transportation systems are owned by the government, an additional child imposes a much larger burden upon others than in the United States, where schooling is the only major cost of a child that the parents do not pay from their own pockets. If the parents pay the full costs of a child, their individual childbearing decisions are likely to be optimal for the community at large. Summary. At the heart of much of contemporary theorizing about population growth is the belief that, as one widely read author put it, the Malthusian laws of population are as valid today as when they were formulated, in the first edition of his essay. The core of those laws is that population increases faster than does the means of sustenance until the standard of living has fallen to bare subsistence. Those who urge this proposition support it with analogies drawn from other forms of life. The germs of existence contained in this earth, if they could freely develop themselves, would fill millions of worlds in the course of a few thousand years. Necessity, that imperious, all-pervading law of nature, restrains them within the prescribed bounds. The race of plants and the race of animals shrink under this great restrictive law, and men cannot, by any efforts of reason, escape from it. Indeed, they are as valid, invalid then, invalid now. The notion of a geometrical or exponential growth in population has been around a very long time. It was old stuff by Malthus's time. Jefferson, Koch and Peden, 1944-327, used it in a matter-of-fact fashion when speaking with satisfaction of the population growth of the United States. One cannot sensibly say, however, whether or not the experience of humanity evidences such a growth pattern, and hence whether there is a tendency to do so. The rate of growth has been much higher in a few periods than in most other periods, see Fig. 22.2, and the rate has tended to increase over the millennia until now, which argues against smooth geometrical growth, but for faster than geometrical growth. The variations from any simple pattern are so great, however, that in my view, a prudent forecaster would not forecast a future rate on the basis of such a pattern for anything shorter than a period of many millennia. Nor is the idea of ideal geometrical growth useful, I think. One might observe such a pattern for a non-human species for a short time in a controlled environment in which nutriment is continually unlimited. But this is hardly a reasonable basis for drawing conclusions about growth in other environments for non-human species, nor for drawing conclusions for humans who supply their own nutrition in a very systematic feedback manner. I think one must conclude that this is a classic case of the importation of a concept useful in one field to another field where it has no relevance, simply because of its intellectual power and charm. Furthermore, if one believed that the exponential model is a good one, that is, if one assumes that population grows exponentially, it would be reasonable to assume that subsistence grows at an even faster exponential rate, largely but not entirely because of population growth, and capacity to produce new technical knowledge of subsistence and other aspects of the standard of living grows at a still faster exponential rate, due in large part to the growth of knowledge. Implicit in this statement, and quite explicit in Malthus's first edition and in the writings of many writers today, is the assumption that people, or at least poor people, breed naturally and without limit due to untrammeled copulation. But as Malthus came to accept in his subsequent editions, and as is shown with a variety of evidence in this chapter, people everywhere give much thought to marriage, sex, and procreation. The notion of untrammeled copulation expresses either ignorance or untruth. Income affects fertility everywhere. In poor countries, an increase in income leads in the short run to an increase in fertility, but in the longer run, in poor countries as elsewhere, a sustained increase in income leads eventually to a decrease in fertility. Decreased child mortality, increased education, and movement from country to city all contribute to this lowering of the birth rate. This process is known as the demographic transition. Malthus's early but still popularly accepted theorizing, which he himself later rejected, does not fit the facts.